afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the Brainy Boomer Lecture Series. We're so very happy you've all joined us today. In 2007, the McGill University Research Center for Studies in Aging, or the MCSH Education Committee, started the Brainy Boomer Lecture Series in order to suggest practical steps to both improve and maintain brain health, as well as to promote healthy lifestyle choices amongst the most populous generation in history. The MCSH Education Committee, which was founded in 1996, has three main objectives: identifying education needs of healthcare providers, seniors, caregivers, and the public, and to develop responses to meet some of their needs; to enhance the positive image of the aging process by addressing stereotypes and myths about aging; and finally, the dissemination of research on aging. Sivaniya completed her undergraduate training at the University of Toronto, where she specialized in neuroscience with minors in psychology and physiology. At McGill, she earned her master's degree, where she investigated whether multilingualism over the lifespan impacts men and women in a way that differentially promotes cognitive function. Her current research as a PhD candidate aims to characterize brain aging trajectories of women and men throughout the adult lifespan and the factors that differentiate typical aging trajectories from atypical cases, such as Alzheimer's disease. In understanding the importance of protective lifestyle factors in preserving cognition and promoting healthy living, Sivaniya was motivated to initiate the Wisdom Exchange Project to promote intergenerational exchange between students and older adults in Ontario and Quebec. Before continuing, we would like to remind you to please mute your microphone on Zoom, and that if you have any questions, just wait until the end of the conference, or you could write them down in the chat box on Zoom. And now I'd like to invite Sivaniya to start her presentation, the Wisdom Exchange Project.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you so much, Caitlin, for that introduction. I'm so excited to be here today to talk to everyone about first my research on healthy aging, and then the Wisdom Exchange Project, as Caitlin mentioned, which is a community project that is led by myself as well as a team of graduate students across Ontario and Quebec. And the goal of this project is really to connect students with older adults in the community for meaningful intergenerational friendships. But before going into describing the Wisdom Exchange Project, as I mentioned, I'll give you a little introduction about myself as well as my research. Yeah, feel free to any questions in the chat. There will be some slides where hopefully we'll get a discussion going, but I would like to keep it as informal as possible. So if you have any questions or comments throughout, please don't hesitate to interrupt. Okay, great. So yeah, so I just wanted to share a bit of my story and how I got here to sort of be in this space with you all, talking to you all. So I was actually born in Sri Lanka, which is a little island, a teardrop island right below India. But my family, we immigrated to Canada when I was young because of an ongoing civil war. So our family settled in Toronto, which is where I grew up and completed my early schooling. So this is actually a picture of me when I was a young girl. And as you can see, there's a book to the side here, and that was a book that I was currently obsessed with. I loved to read as a kid. I spent a lot of time in the library. And I think as a result of reading a lot, I also had a very active imagination. So as you can see in this photo, I have bangs, which were not cut by a professional barber. That was cut by myself because it was a consequence of a conversation that I had with my hair. So, you know, I had quite the sort of active imagination, talked to a lot of objects, and it was just sort of a fun childhood in that way, because it was, you know, active friendships with other people, but then also with objects as well. So as I grew up, I completed my undergraduate training at the University of Toronto, where I specialized in neuroscience. The process of completing my bachelor's was actually incredibly tough for me. I don't think I would say I excelled as much in my studies, but thankfully I actually had the chance to work in a few labs during the summers and on the side. And I really loved this environment of learning. I realized that there's a different sort of way to learn in school. And then there was a different way of learning when you were actually in the lab conducting experiments. And I found that I really excelled in the lab environment. So almost every summer I worked in a different lab on different projects, and I really got the chance to explore what I really liked about research. And as I was completing my undergraduate degree, I was really figuring out whether or not I wanted to pursue graduate school and pursue my doctoral studies. As you can imagine, I was really a bit ambivalent because I had a bit of an ambivalent experience throughout my undergraduate degree. So I sort of did a metaphorical coin flip. I decided to apply to only one school. If I got in, I would go, but if I didn't, I would kind of figure out another path. So I kind of took my chances in that way. And much to my surprise, I got accepted to McGill for my graduate studies. And I decided to move to Montreal and was really happy to discover that graduate school was completely different from my undergraduate education. In fact, most of my time was spent in the lab rather than in class, which I really loved. And it was really it's been fun because it's just time spent exploring your ideas, thinking in a more free way, for me at least, that I enjoyed. So that's a bit about me and my story. But as I was sort of sharing this story with you all, perhaps some of you transported yourselves with me on this journey. And sort of this, I think, is an amazing feature of storytelling, which is that it gives us the ability to imagine how someone's story unfolds as we listen to them, basically. And the ability to sort of remember and recall these stories and memories makes us who we are, but also gives us the ability to connect with other people. It gives us the ability to connect with families, our friends, our community. And right now, speaking with you all, connecting with you all, this story is giving me the opportunity to sort of reach out through my laptop and reach your homes through my story. So stories have this sort of powerful capacity to basically allow us to travel back in time, and forms what is the basis of what we call episodic memories, which is our memory for personal events. The interesting thing about two people remember the same event is that we're all sort of drawn to different aspects of the event, and in terms of what exactly we remember. So it kind of reminds me actually of this parable of the blindfolded men and the elephant, which is a story of a group of blindfolded people who've never seen an elephant before, and who learn what the elephant is just by touching it. So they're blindfolded, and each blindfolded person feels a different part of the elephant's body, such as, for example, the side or like the tusk. And then they then describe the elephant based on their limited experience, and their descriptions of the elephant are different from each other, as you can imagine. So the moral of the parable is that so much of our reality of the world is based on our own subjective experience, which may be completely different, but still a valid experiences from other people. So for me, this is a lot like our memory in a way too, which is that what we remember is largely based on what we pay attention to. And it's possible that the same event can happen to two separate individuals, but the recounting of that event may differ based on the individual. It can differ individual to individual based on what people are attending to, based on even, for example, their personalities. So just like there are individual call events, our ability to remember is also quite dynamic and changes across the lifespan. So healthy aging is truly a heterogeneous process, and everyone ages differently. So even within the domain of memory, the ability to remember different types of information varies with age. So often there is a preservation of what we call semantic memory, which is our ability to remember facts or general knowledge. But we observe greater changes in our memory for personal events, which I termed episodic memories, which are called episodic memories. So these differences in memory performance across the adult lifespan is largely reflected actually in what brain structure and function. And that's what we as scientists, as psychologists, try to sort of understand, is this relationship between brain structure and function, how that is modulated over time, and how that impacts cognitive performance. But the interesting thing actually is that not everything is completely explained by this relationship between brain and cognitive performance. So when we look into this further and we ask ourselves, why isn't there a complete like mapping between brain structure, function, and cognition? Well, we can actually I see that there are some questions, but I'll come to it in a moment. But we can see basically that these differences could actually also be explained by individual differences. So these individual differences could be sex, for example, as a biological variable, gender as determined by social cultural factors, but that there are also other factors that can help explain our understanding of the cognitive aging process. For example, there are non-modifiable factors, which are basically factors which we can't change, such as having a genetic risk for dementia or a family history of dementia. But there are also modifiable factors which you actually do have control over, such as making changes to your lifestyle. So all this to say, I think in our research, we're more moving in the direction of taking this sort of holistic understanding of the individual in order to sort of understand this heterogeneity of the aging process. Caitlin, did you want to take this moment to ask questions, or should we wait till the end? I see that there's a few comments in the chat.
So, no, I mean, it's more of a technical issue.
Okay, sounds good.
You're good.
Yeah, sorry, I can't quite see. Okay, perfect. So I'll wait till the end. Okay, great. So, for me and my research, I'm particularly interested in exploring sex differences with age. It's especially relevant in brain aging research because clinically studies have actually reported that women are disproportionately affected by Alzheimer's disease than men. So Alzheimer's disease is a neurodegenerative disorder. And it's characterized by progressive cognitive decline over and above what is seen in healthy aging. So when we look at risk factors for Alzheimer's disease and the major risk factors that are involved, besides age, these risk factors include these factors such as sex, a family history of Alzheimer's disease, the ApoE4 genetic risk, as well as cardiovascular health, which can include factors such as your body weight, your blood pressure, or even levels of physical activity. And so as you can see also, like as I pointed out these factors, some of these factors are non-modifiable, as I mentioned. So these are factors that you cannot change. But there are other factors that are modifiable, such as cardiovascular health. So, you know, it's sort of up to you, like the levels of physical activity. These are factors that you could have a control over, for example. So just like in healthy aging, episodic memory decline is sort of an early deficit in Alzheimer's disease, suggesting that there might be similar neural mechanisms at play. And really, it tells us that it is important to differentiate what is healthy, because we do see sort of differences in episodic memory that are changing with age that are completely normal compared to what is atypical, such as the case of Alzheimer's disease. So for my research in particular, I'm really interested in understanding and sort of developing this working model of healthy aging that is really representative of the sexes and can really help us understand, sex differences that are in aging, as well as age-related disorders such as Alzheimer's disease. So as I mentioned, healthy aging involves greater changes in episodic memory, which is our ability to encode, store, and retrieve personal events. So an example of an episodic memory lapse, which can happen to us all, is like not remembering where you placed your car keys or when you left them. So I wanted to sort of take this pause to sort of highlight that forgetfulness in general is actually really quite normal, and we see it across the adult lifespan. It's not specific to older adults, for example. So for example, like forgetting where you placed your car keys is actually kind of normal. And age is a factor that can impact our levels of forgetfulness, but there are also other factors that can also modulate our ability to to remember at a specific moment. So for example, the level of stress that we're experiencing in a particular moment can also impact whether or not, for example, we forgot where we placed our car keys. So it's really important to know that, you know, this is a really normal process. It still happens within, for example, a particular age group. And it's only when it's extreme levels. So for example, not remembering your car keys or where you placed your car keys is normal. But then, for example, if you don't remember like why you use your car keys, that's when you should be concerned. So it's important to sort of distinguish this sort of the difference between what is concerning and what is not concerning, and that actually there's a lot of variability associated with the degrees of forgetfulness that we experience across the adult lifespan. So these age-related differences in memory is actually associated with both structural and functional differences in brain regions. It's not specific to a particular brain region. It's actually a distributed network of brain regions. So as you can see, sort of highlighted in this sort of pink area are these sort of regions that are typically involved in episodic memory, for example. And so I'm sure most of you are familiar with the frontal cortex, which is involved in executive function and higher cognitive abilities. But then also here is like the medial temporal lobes, which houses the hippocampus and is really implicated in memory processes and encoding of new events, for example. But when we look at the research as scientists, there are actually many studies that investigate age differences in brain activity during memory performance, but they don't actually specifically look into sex differences. So what they do in their analyses is they actually pool both men and women participants in their analyses without explicitly checking whether or not there are differences in brain performance or actual memory performance in women compared to men, for example. So this is kind of striking because there is some evidence that exists out there that show that there are sex differences in episodic memory. And so that sort of further motivates the need to stratify analyses by sex. So basically doing whatever analyses that we've previously been doing, but seeing if actually what we're seeing in the full sample is applying also just to men or applying just to women, for example. So the first study that I'm actually going to be talking to you about is actually the first study that I did for my PhD program. And I wanted to sort of test this assumption by examining whether men and women exhibit similar patterns of brain activity in relationship to memory performance. So do we see similarities and or differences in how people are engaging in a particular memory task? So that's what I set out to do. We used a subsample. So in this study, we used a subsample of women and men who were matched based on age and education. This was a sort of an ongoing lifespan cohort, lifespan study that was conducted in the lab that I'm currently working on. And the final sample in the study consisted of 41 men and 41 women, ranging in age between 21 and 76 years. So we really had a good sort of lifespan cohort of young to sort of older adults. And so we really could see how women and men are performing differently across the adult lifespan. It is important to note that study participants met a range of strict inclusion and exclusion criteria to ensure that we were sort of assessing this this process without the confounding effects of other possible issues. For example, a history of neurological insult or psychological illness, for example. But I do sort of think that future research should include this to see how participants might differ based on their different histories, for example, health histories, for example. So participants completed an episodic memory task while undergoing the fMRI scanning. So by completing this memory task in the scanner, we're basically able to measure the brain's activity while people are completing the task. So this really allows us to essentially relate brain activation to memory performance directly. So that's sort of the advantage of doing the task under the scanner, is that it is a direct correlation between brain activity during task performance and the actual performance on the memory task. So I'm going to give you an overview of the task itself. So this is the episodic memory task. There are 3 phases. So this is the first phase. It's called the encoding phase. And this is the phase where participants are shown a series of black and white photos of faces, and they're presented either to the left or right of the fixation cross. And participants are asked to remember the face as well as its spatial location. And after each trial of the encoding phase, the participant is also asked to rate the face as being pleasant or neutral. And the reason why we ask this question is really to ensure that participants are paying attention to the task, but then it also is meant to help them with encoding of the faces that they're seeing at encoding. So following the encoding, there is actually a distraction task phase. So this is a 1-minute alphabetization task that prevents participants from actively rehearsing the face stimuli. So basically what we want to this sort of ensures that we're investigating episodic memory, long-term memory, because we don't basically want to account for the effects of like active rehearsal between encoding and retrieval. And so this essentially prevents people from, using these sort of active strategies. And then following the distraction task, there's a retrieval phase where participants are shown a series of 2 faces that they saw during encoding, and they were instructed to select which of the 2 faces were presented either on the left or right of the screen, depending on the retrieval cue. So that's basically the sort of the gist of the task. There's the encoding where they're seeing new faces, and there's the retrieval where they're seeing faces that they previously saw at encoding, and they're asked to identify the location. And that's basically how we're assessing episodic memory. So if you recall, episodic memory is remembering the item as well as either the spatial context or the temporal context. And in this case, it's the spatial context that we're truly assessing. Importantly, this task contains a difficulty component. So there's a spatial hard version of the task and an easy version of the task. And the important thing to sort of remember is that in the hard version of the task, participants are basically asked to remember more faces during encoding and retrieve more faces during retrieval compared to the easy version of the task. So our behavioral results, basically, so this is sort of the figure that represents our behavioral results. So as you can see on the x-axis, we have age of participants from approximately 19 to 76 years. And then we have performance on their task. And as you can see, there's a decline with decline of performance with age. But also, if you look at the range is still quite high. So there are differences between younger adults compared to older adults, but it's not, the performance is not so low that it's concerning. People in general are performing extremely well on the task, but we are seeing at the statistical level, we are seeing differences between younger and older adults, such that older adults performed worse compared to the younger adults. And as you can see, there's this blue line, and then there's also this yellow line. So this just shows that people generally performed worse on the hard version of the task compared to the easy version of the task. So that was the general finding in terms of the actual memory performance on the task. When we looked at sex differences, though, whether or not men and women performed differently on the episodic memory task and with age, we actually found no significant sex differences in memory performance. So basically, both women and men performed equally well on the task, and there was also no effects of age. So with age, all women see similar performance effects between women and men. So this is sort of just the results at the behavioral level. So how people performed on the task itself. But then we were actually curious to see, did we see differences at the brain level, essentially? And as you can remember, this was the picture that I showed earlier on that identified brain regions that were involved in episodic memory. And what we found generally is that men and women actually perform, although they performed equally well across ages, the neuroimaging findings actually painted a totally different picture, which is that how men and women performed the memory task was slightly different. So specifically, during the encoding of faces, the brain activity showed that men and women showed similar patterns of brain activation in relationship to memory performance, but during retrieval, we see differences in brain activity in relationship to performance. So, and it's specifically involving some of these brain regions that I mentioned that are already involved in episodic memory. So how they are recruiting these different brain regions in relationship to performance is varying slightly between men and women. So this is really quite interesting because it's telling us that when we look at just at memory, there's no difference. So this is just the outcome. When we look at memory outcomes, men and women are performing similarly, and across the adult lifespan, they're performing similarly as well. But when we're looking at it at the brain level, we're seeing that at the brain level, women and men are showing differences in brain activity in relationship to performance, and especially with age. So this really tells us that there might be different functional strategies at play that women and men may be engaging in that might be contributing to differences at the functional level, but at the end of the day, it's still resulting in sort of equivalent performance between across participants, for example. So in general, the findings revealed that both sexes engaged similar brain regions to support memory performance, which is actually consistent with the behavioral results indicating no significant differences. But we determined that even in the absence of significant behavioral differences, both women and men showed memory-related brain activity differences with age. So given the sort of impact of these sex differences in our functional analysis, I was actually interested in determining whether there were other individual differences that might be contributing to differences in the aging process, for example. So I actually moved in my next study, I moved beyond just looking at sex differences and looked at other sort of protective lifestyle factors that might be contributing to sort of differences in memory performance. So this is sort of like a figure that I sort of came up with, but essentially, I don't know if so essentially cognitive reserve is used in the aging literature quite a bit, and it's a term that it refers to our ability to accumulate protection to combat age-related disorders or even other neurological insults such as stroke. So basically, these are lifestyle factors or experiences that help us build reserve across the lifespan so that when we are hit with an insult to the brain, our brains can better adapt and continue functioning, for example. So like cognitive reserve could be any sort of protective factors that we have or that we engage in that help us combat risk factors that we have no control over, for example, or our risk for developing dementia or in case we get, for example, a stroke. So how we sort of adapt at the brain level to continue engaging in daily life. So I kind of talked to everyone about cognitive reserve at sort of this higher level. But I kind of wanted to open the discussion to everyone and ask, when I give you this description of cognitive reserve, what is it that you think of? Are there any sort of specific lifestyle factors that you can think of that actually contributes to someone's cognitive reserve, for example? So feel free to sort of drop this in the chat or just unmute and engage in sort of like a bit of a discussion. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I guess while we wait for people to type in the chat box, there was a question earlier. Somebody wanted to know how they were performing the tasks while in the MRI.
Yes, so that's actually a sort of an advantage of these specific fMRI scanners that we use. So basically people are put in the scanner and they have a button box. And basically when they're put in the scanner, they can look up and they'll see a screen that's projected from the scanner room, and they'll see the actual task above sort of their face, and it's like in the scanner itself. And then in the meantime, they're also holding this button box. So when they're responding to the task stimuli, they can press whatever buttons that they're responding to. So it's all sort of like built in the scanner so that you can actually perform the task while we're collecting information about your brain activity. Okay, great. So we have some responses. Someone is saying brain stimulation activities, physical health, exercise, really great, fitness activity, movement, meditation, playing, learning, enjoying music, nutrition, use of mental exercise to activate brain muscle. Great. Drinking, high cholesterol, blood pressure affects our brain for sure. Okay, great. So everyone is basically on the ball with this, and lifestyle, yeah, essentially. Exactly. So some of you mentioned this, but education also might contribute to cognitive reserve, for example, and it's actually used as sort of like the most common proxy measure. Social support. I think someone mentioned cognitively stimulating activities, which can encompass various different things, including bilingualism, for example. So there's so many different sort of factors that, as we sort of saw in the chat, and as I've listed here, that can contribute to cognitive reserve, and it's really quite great because, you know, based on our own interests, we can also engage in different sort of activities that are also fun for us too, right? Because the idea is, you know, you want to have like a you want to engage sort of in a lifestyle that is super meaningful to you. And like, if engaging in sort of like learning a new language is fun for you, that's awesome. But that could mean that someone else is engaging in other lifestyle factors that contribute to their reserve in a different way. But it does sort of at the research level, it makes it a little bit complicated for us researchers, because as you can imagine, there are so many different things that you can sort of understand about an individual, and in terms of like what contributes to their reserve, and how those factors are sort of protecting against any sort of like disorders or you know, neurological insult, for example. So I also wanted to sort of give everyone sort of like the formal definition of reserve as defined in the literature. So oh yeah, so yeah, sorry. So this next study that I'm going to be talking to you about, I basically conducted a literature review with my colleagues, and we really basically wanted to comprehensively explore whether important lifestyle factors, also called reserve contributors, the factors that a lot of you listed in the previous slide, differentially promote healthy aging and reduce AD risk in the sexes, but particularly in women who have greater AD prevalence. And we basically approached this question using a systematic literature review. And that's because not many studies, as I mentioned, do like a comprehensive collection of participants' lifestyle and social background in any one study. So we thought it would be best to take this approach to the literature and distill kind of what is known about sex differences in reserve contributors through sort of one systematic literature review. So the dominant model of reserve in the literature, as I mentioned, is what's actually postulated by Dr. Yakov Stern. And specifically, he sort of defines reserve as the gradual accumulation of neurocognitive resources across the lifespan that can preserve cognitive function by reducing the effects of age and AD-related neuropathology. So as you can see here, reserve is meant to contribute to cognition. But the interesting thing is that in the literature, we actually distinguish between two different types of reserve. So there is brain reserve, which emphasizes the quantitative measures of structural integrity, such as, for example, so structural brain integrity, I mean, so that can include the overall brain size or the number of neurons that all sort of help support cognitive performance. So you can sort of think of this as the hardware, so the brain as the hardware, the physical brain. But then there's also cognitive reserve, which basically emphasizes the effect that the lifetime accumulation of cognitive, social, and physically enriched experiences have on brain function and cognitive performance. So with cognitive reserve, these are the factors that you've listed in the previous slide. So like physical health, physical exercise, cognitively stimulating activities. So the idea is with cognitive reserve, it seems it's a bit complicated because these are all sort of proxy measures that contribute to this greater reserve. And, you know, when we look at brain function, actually, we're seeing that, you know, with greater, the hypothesis is that with greater reserve, the person can better adapt at the functional level to neurological insult or to other sort of pathologies, for example, that might occur in the individual. So according to this model, the hypothesis is that individuals with high cognitive reserve will show better cognitive performance and later cognitive decline in the presence of equal amounts of AD pathology compared to individuals with low reserve. But for me, I was interested, as I mentioned, is seeing if men and women, if there are differences in reserve contributors, because to date, there is no research that specifically looked at sex differences in reserve and whether or not that might be contributing to either preventing or delaying AD, which actually can be really crucial in terms of informing us about specific lifestyle interventions that can help mitigate AD and whether or not that might differ in men compared to women, for example. So we conducted a systematic review of the literature for sex or gender differences in contributors to reserve. So these are the specific databases that I used, but as you can see, sort of this is the overall process. We used, so what we did is like we searched these sort of research engines using these keywords. So we look for sex differences, gender differences, cognitive reserve, brain reserve, Alzheimer's disease, AD. And in addition to using these keywords, we also look for specific reserve contributors that are listed in the literature. So we decided to be specific in terms of like, instead of just saying reserve, we said, let's look for education, let's look for IQ, let's look for occupation, cognitively stimulating activities, bilingualism, physical activity, and social support. So we basically mined the literature to look for papers that investigated reserve contributors and their effects in terms of preventing or delaying AD and whether or not there were any sex differences in terms of protection against AD. And as you can see, there were quite a lot of papers that came out in the original search, so over 870 articles. But we finally got to 63 articles that explicitly looked at sex or gender differences in protecting against, these reserve contributors and protecting against AD. and the articles that actually made it to the final review and that were truly illegible, so that they actually looked at sex or gender differences, where there were only 16 papers that actually investigated sex differences or gender differences in reserve and protection against AD. So it was quite a few to work with. So as I mentioned, our search returned 63 papers that met eligibility criteria, and only 16 separated their data by sex and actually explored sex differences. So the specific papers that looked at sex differences in reserve considered education, IQ, occupation, and bilingualism. So these are the number of studies that looked into the specific reserve contributors. So there were the most number of studies were focused on education. So there were 7 studies that looked at sex differences and the effects of education in protecting against AD. And generally what we found was that these 16 studies showed that engaging in greater reserves, so engaging in these reserve contributors was actually beneficial in lowering AD risk in both sexes. But in some instances, so particularly with education, we found that actually engaged in greater education, it was actually more beneficial in protecting against AD for them compared to men. So that was kind of an interesting sort of nuance, but clearly we need more research to sort of determine like how the specific role of these different factors and the specific role of reserve in protecting against AD, because 16 is just not enough to really have a full picture. But it was kind of interesting to see that when women did engage in some of these reserve contributors, we found like sort of a greater effect in protecting against AD than we did in men, for example. And we found no studies that looked into sex differences in protecting against AD for other factors such as socioeconomic status, social support, cognitively stimulating activities, or physical activities. So clearly more research is needed to really understand what's happening in these other reserve contributors and how that's protecting against AD specifically, and if there's a difference, if we're seeing a difference in men compared to women. So I wanted to sort of take a pause here and ask you, actually, when I say, or talk to you about sort of a point that we sort of noticed when we were writing up this paper and discussing the findings of this paper, which is that reserve contributors might be gendered. So when I say that to you, what comes to mind for you? Like, can you sort of imagine how certain reserve contributors, certain sort of lifestyle factors might be gendered, and how that might be influencing our interpretation of the results, for example? So I'll let you chat, or if you feel free to unmute and to discuss this. There's no right, there really isn't a right answer to this question.
Sivaniya, I was thinking, if you can hear me, to what extent, whether it's gendered or not, but the repetitiveness of certain activities. So I'm thinking a reserve contributor, if one has been a driver of a car all one's life, there's a reason that insurance rates come down as you get older, because you almost sort of click into an activity and your brain reserves of understanding and judgment are much greater because you've had more experience doing it. And it occurred to me, with respect to things like cooking, baking, things that are done repetitively. I'm thinking especially for older women, maybe who have done more of the cooking. I'm going to guess that people with Alzheimer's could probably put a meal on the table because they've done it so much raising children that it's just a guess. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like those neural pathways just keep going and going and going, and you go into automatic. Maybe I'm wrong.
No, I think you have, you're making a really, really great point. And the interesting thing actually is that the parts of the brain that are involved in habits, sort of what you're speaking to, which is, just this repetitive behaviors that really don't even involve our cognitive function, because it's sort of like ingrained in us. We're so like used to doing it, we do it sort of automatically. They are like the last to be affected. So it's kind of an interesting point in AD, for example, or dementia, in this specific type of dementia. And so that's kind of interesting, because like usually like we can kind of like rely on people to sort of engage in these sort of repetitive behaviors, because they don't really necessarily need to recruit the regions that might actually be impacted early on in the dementia process, for example.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I've heard that the recall, for example, of past events associated with stories from their childhood are so much more easily recalled than events in the more recent, because I guess those pathways, I don't know, were laid down early and became, I'm totally guessing here.
No, you're absolutely right. Actually, there is a temporal nature of these memories as well, with like a lot of sort of a lot of these, I think the sort of like term that people use is it becomes, so a lot of these early memories, they're so, they don't necessarily rely on the medial temporal lobe regions, and it's in a way like, with recruiting sort of other regions such as like the prefrontal cortex, which might not be affected as early on. And so people are actually remembering these early memories compared to more recent memories, where we might see more of an effect, because they're still relying on these medial temporal lobe regions, for example. I think someone's raising their hand. Did you want to speak? I don't know who it is though. Yeah, Camilla. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much for a fantastic presentation. I enjoyed very much. I was a nurse, so I saw the doctors who were so much active, brainly, and with the patient and busy and things like that. And then they get the severe dementia that they thought is Alzheimer's disease. Or I have a friend who was playing like 3 times a week bridge, and 3 times a week she was playing tennis, that they said it's motivate the brain, and she's so demented now. So it's hard.
It's definitely really hard. And, unfortunately, I mean, maybe, I don't know if it's necessarily, I think the focus still is on, prevention, really. I think someone's on mic. Okay, no, muted. Okay, perfect. Yeah, so the focus really is on prevention, and engaging in these lifestyle factors, or in these cognitively stimulating activities before someone sort of progresses to sort of a severe stage, because the idea is to really, as much as possible, delay dementia onset, and then once an individual does get it, to sort of there's still benefits, obviously, of higher reserve in sort of combating the effects of pathology, for example. But I see in the chat also that people are mentioning different factors, such as stress might have an impact, and totally agree, like levels that there might be differences in stress that might be contributing to, individual differences in the ability of someone to sort of combat pathology. But I think someone mentioned maybe men are more dependent on health, but women may be more linked to. So yep, that's a great point. So this is great. Access to education, especially early aspect, women are more. Okay, so I think what I'm seeing overall is access, right? So that's sort of like the key term that I'm getting throughout some of these comments, and that's so true. So when I looked at or when we as authors looked at a lot of these studies that we reviewed, a lot of the older adults at the time, they grew up in a time when access to education, access to occupation was far lower for women than it was for men. And so that was an interesting point. It wasn't necessarily that, it's just this point that, and it's really a hopeful point too, because right now we're living in a society where currently there's more equal access to both women and men, and to all individuals. And I think it's sort of an interesting point to consider, for example, when you're looking into how people are performing differently. And the other sort of important thing, and so there's, and then also like physical activity. So when you look at the literature in terms of access to physical activity, and in terms of like encouragement of physical activity, we see that there are sort of sex differences in physical activity, with men tending to engage more in physical activity than women. But that's changing, and that's really great. It's that everyone is sort of engaging in these factors, and there's sort of more equal access or growing access to these opportunities that are enabling people to engage in these reserve factors, and helping people live a sort of a more healthier lifestyle. And someone also mentioned social support, which is also a really great point. There are many studies that seem to show that there are sex and gender differences in social support and social networks. And so that might be, contributing to some of the results that we're seeing, and in a way that might actually be benefiting women more, in that, they're relying on their spouses, but they're also potentially relying on the larger networks that they have, for example. And so actually it's kind of a nice bridge into the next slide, which is really the importance of social support, and the fact that that can really help with brain health and brain structural integrity. So this is there's a recent study that was done actually at McGill University by a group led by Dr. Sprang and Dr. Brisdock. And what they did is they actually looked at the brains of over 40,000 middle-aged and older adult participants that were from this UK Biobank. So this is sort of the UK Biobank is an open access database that's available to health scientists around the world. And they basically looked at the MRI, the brain data of participants who reported often feeling lonely compared to those who reported not feeling lonely. And they found that the researchers basically found several differences in the brains of lonely people. And so this is actually not from their paper, but I wanted to show that it seemed like the brain regions converged in what we as scientists call the default mode network. And so the default mode network tends to be active actually when we're not actively engaged in a task, and when we're just sort of like in idle thinking. So when we're thinking about the past, when we're thinking about the future, or a hypothetical present, these brain regions that are highlighted in blue tend to be active, and that's sort of what we call the default mode network. And what these researchers found is that lonely individuals, there's sort of greater integrity of the default mode network, and that compared to sort of people who don't report feelings of loneliness. And what I thought was really interesting, and what has already been established in the literature, is like these default mode networks also overlap with a lot of the regions that are involved in memory, for example. So it's a really interesting study. I kind of put the link here, so if anyone's interested in reading, I think it's available to everyone. But it really shows that there are sort of neural correlates even to sort of social contact and the corollary, which is like loneliness, and the importance of engaging in social activity and engaging in strong social networks. And then this is sort of another sort of important study for me, at least. It was very fascinating to read the study. It was a review by Professor Jill Livingston, who basically did this intense literature review and found that there are 12 really significant modifiable factors that can delay or prevent up to 40% of dementia. So that's a really big, significant number, and tells us really that we have a lot of control in sort of how we engage in our lifestyles. And among these 12 is actually social contact. So to me, it's really driving home the point that engaging in in meaningful social contact, friendships, and networks is super necessary to sort of for our own sense of meaning, but then also for our own brain health as well. And as you can imagine, right now with the current COVID-19 pandemic, it's having a significant impact on everyone, and our ability to socialize and our ability to sort of reach out to people, to family and friends, just because it's by nature of the disease, it's restricting in-person social contact. So, there's obviously a greater risk of loneliness at all age groups because of this pandemic. It's sort of a good transition into the Wisdom Exchange Project, which is a project that is led by myself and, as I mentioned, a team of phenomenal graduate students in Ontario and Quebec. And basically what we've been trying to do is trying to create this platform that connects students in Ontario and Quebec. So these are graduate students and postdoctoral fellows with older adults in Ontario and Quebec for meaningful intergenerational friendships. So the idea really is to provide a platform where people can build friendships and reach out, obviously online, not in person, given the current circumstances, and just share different perspectives, different experiences and cultures. And hopefully, depending on your preferences, like engage in fun activities that are also cognitively stimulating. So really, we kind of leave it up to you to sort of figure out how the friendship will sort of cultivate. But we do sort of provide this platform. And if any of you are interested, it would be, please feel free to reach out. And yeah, I just wanted to sort of give a shout out to the WEP team. So these are the students behind the initiative who have been actively working to sort of to get this going, basically. So Danielle, Alicia, Monica, Lauren, and Emma, and we meet very frequently to sort of to work on this project and to make sure that everyone is comfortable and everyone is having a good time with their partners. But we're also looking for more people. So if you are interested in helping in any way, please feel free to reach out. We're always happy to sort of get different perspectives and make sure that we're integrating community feedback in the development of our project. It's really important that we sort of listen to what people have to say and integrate that. But just to sort of give you an overview of the process, it basically happens, it starts with sort of you being interested. So if you are interested, you complete this online questionnaire, and this questionnaire these are allows us to sort of get to know you a little bit, but then we also ask some questions based on your specific interests and your hobbies. And the reason why we ask this is we want to kind of match you to a student based on mutual interests, mutual preferences. We think this will be a sort of a great starting point to develop this friendship. So if you want to be matched based on a specific language or based on hobbies, Danielle, who is the student really behind the matching process, does a phenomenal job in terms of really trying her best to match people based on mutual interests. So once you complete the questionnaire, we match you, and then the wisdom exchange begins. And it's sort of up to you how you want to communicate. That could be by email, it could be by phone, or it could be by Zoom. So totally up to you. We leave it up to you. And then a secondary component is the WEP research seminars, which all of you have a little sort of taste of based on the research that I presented to you today. the goal is really just to have monthly knowledge translation seminars. And this is really just an opportunity for everyone, the web community, to sort of gather at the community level and exchange in knowledge translation. So the idea is that the students are graduate students who are doing research in different fields. And so it's a time for them to sort of share their research and share their projects with the community and get feedback and get just a discussion going, because we don't really have the opportunity to really talk about our research beyond sort of our usually beyond like our own lab environment or our own research niche. So it's really a great way for us to sort of leave that community behind and talk to people who are different and people who have different experiences and can bring something different to the table. So this is the second sort of seminar that we're hosting, but we would love to have like an opportunity to sort of have, these research seminars. But if people want to sort of share stories like I did at the beginning of my talk today, that would be like a really cool thing we're open to. So if you're interested in taking the first 10 minutes to talk about your life or your stories, that's something that we're totally down. We're totally open to sort of organizing. So that's the secondary component of of the web. And if you're interested, please feel free to visit our website or email us, and we're more than happy to sort of get the process going.